Hi, everybody. Morning, afternoon, evening. I'm Yuval, and we're continuing the sessions about fixing OKRs. And today we're going to focus on scaling. So why is scaling such an issue in the world of OKRs? So let's recap what we were talking about in the last couple of times. We talked about the challenges with having too many OKRs, the challenges with having output, and even worse, activity-based OKRs that track activity, not necessarily valuable progress towards outcomes. We discussed why that is so dangerous or ineffective in a world where we're trying to achieve goals in a complex, uncertain reality when facing different types of friction. And today we'll talk about a couple of aspects of scaling. So if you're an organization that is relatively small, maybe you can just establish company level OKRs that focus on the really strategic things, what's really important for you as an organization, big rocks, and just use that to create alignment across the organization around what's important and to drive people to focus on the right things. And maybe if you really focused your OKRs on that growth or development, not just on KPIs or all activity, maybe that's fine. But as the organization grows, as you start to scale up, or maybe even you're currently dozens or hundreds of people, that might not be enough. People might look at an objective at the company level, like, for example, achieving scalable growth using product-led motion. And while that might be clear to them, why are we trying to do that and what's the overall strategy, it might not be that clear to them what's their mission within that. If they're a team that's focused on some aspect of the product or some of the marketing assets or branding for the company, or even customer success, it might be vague for them. Okay, what does that mean for me? What's the call to action for me within that lofty goal of product-led growth? And in those environments, it definitely makes sense to deconstruct that OKR into smaller objectives, smaller outcomes that we want to build towards the overall goal, like the North Star metric that we might have around growth, let's say, will also be broken down into sub-metrics that together can contribute towards moving the needle on the North Star metric. So with that in mind, let's say we broke down that strategy into smaller pieces. Those smaller pieces ideally are in the form of still objectives, outcomes rather than outputs or activities, but they might be worthwhile carving out. So for example, in this case here of product-led growth, it might make sense to break it down to, okay, one aspect of that is we want to reduce the friction in customer acquisition. And the other piece of enabling scalable growth is we want to have some sort of viral loop. Think, any invite that we send out from our software that enables scheduling meetings like Calendly also refers to Calendly as a solution. So if people actually like booking meetings in Calendly, or my favorite Savical, they actually get a link to starting to use that product themselves. So that might be our hypothesis about the viral loop, and maybe that together with reducing friction, we believe would be what would help us scale without the involvement of a direct sales force. So in this case, that might be our strategy and how it might be spun out to sub OKRs within the organization. So far, so good, right? We want to have clarity on what's the overall strategy, what are the pieces of that strategy. We want to have that in the terms of still outcomes. We want to focus on things that move the needle rather than the business as usual. And what we might see is some sort of cascade of how that company level strategy needs to be brought to life in different areas of the organization. But here is where the problems start. So one of the questions that start to come up here is, okay, cascading. This is something called cascading in the OKR world, and it's even mentioned in Measure What Matters, which is the OKR book by John Doerr. There are some problems with it, though. One of the risks that we might see, and that I often see when I go into organizations, is that it's very challenging for people to break a strategy into sub outcomes. So it's very common that what we see is that once we start to slice that strategy into pieces, we start finding activities or outputs there. We already talked about why it's not ideal to use activities or outputs, so we should try to refrain from that and talk in outcomes. But the more we scale, the more we cascade, the more tempting it is to actually do that, because we're trying to slice bigger things into smaller pieces, and especially if we compound that, like I often see with OKRs that are assigned to a function or a department, or even worse, to an individual. If those individuals or functions or departments can't actually deliver an overall outcome, but we still want to have that accountability of, we want to know who's responsible for this OKR, who's going to be the owner on it, who's going to deliver it. That combination is really dangerous, because that combination of, we want to have that command and control, we want to know who's responsible for what, together with the fact that we have a functional organization rather than an organization that is organized around value, leads to a situation where our OKRs are activity-based, are output-based, and where people actually focus on local optimization, something within, on the good news is it's within their reach, it's something that they can own. The bad news is that even if they succeed, it might not actually deliver the outcome, because they're dependent on so many other people. And in order to actually achieve outcomes, we need the interaction of a lot of OKRs. That actually relates to one of the other patterns that I'm seeing, which is OKR coordination hell. The more OKRs you have, the more you scale or cascade in the organization, especially with departmental or worse, individual OKRs, the more coordination overhead you'll have. And you might hear from people, some techniques about how to actually manage the dependencies, manage that coordination. But the real answer is to try to think through, can we organize around OKRs? Can we ask ourselves, okay, what's the strategy? What's the real outcome we're trying to achieve? And if it's an outcome that will be complex for us to achieve, can we organize the team around that? Or can we maybe share, if we're not organizing a team or team of teams around that, can we at least share these OKRs? Not set specific OKRs based on the function, but share an OKR across all of the teams that need to actually collaborate to achieve that OKR. I really like to use the pattern of assessing the OKRs, identifying what kind of teams make sense in the organization, or what kind of teaming topology makes sense in the organization with the OKRs or with the strategy that we're trying to execute on in mind. That should be major factor into how the teams are set up. So if our teams, whether those are virtual or physical teams, are actually oriented around those OKRs, the challenge of coordinating and executing on these OKRs is a smaller challenge, because we have fewer OKRs. Those are just the real OKRs, not the slicing of OKRs into pieces that functional teams can own or that componental teams can own. And people can actually organize their work and their activities within these smaller set of OKRs, and they can actually have a better chance of being aware of what's the strategy. The more OKRs we have in our network, so the more complex, the picture of the OKRs and how they cascade and how they relate, the lower the chance that people will actually understand what's their role and how it's connected to the bigger picture. Another thing that I see beyond just how you organize your teams and how that creates issues with OKRs is related to, again, the command and control challenge. Organizations that are looking for OKRs to actually help them control what's going on rather than focus on what's strategic typically ask everything to be connected to an OKR, to be mapped to an OKR. I even heard last week about some tool implementations which force everything to be connected somehow all the way to the top, because we need to account for everybody's time. We need to account for all of the activity that happens so that it rolls up to some high level objective. That's not really why we use OKR. So I typically tell people, listen, if you want to have some bin counting of what everything is related to, fine. But those are not OKRs. Those are some buckets of work management that you might choose. The OKRs are just the big rocks that you want to focus on. And it's totally fine, or it should be totally fine, for some work that happens throughout the organization to not connect to the company level OKRs. That work could be local OKRs. So there could be an objective of a product team, a supporting team, a function, an OKR that is implementing a local strategy of what this group is trying to achieve that doesn't directly map to a company level or a higher level OKR. And there could be other work that this team or group, function, department is doing that doesn't even map to an OKR. It might be just maintaining health of KPI or just business as usual development, going back to that anti-pattern of everything needs to be an OKR. Not everything needs to be an OKR. Those patterns are just much more painful to deal with at scale. So if we build from OKRs that are just focused on the right things, it will also be easier to scale. That's what I'm trying to establish here. And that's what I see in the trenches. The other interesting pattern that can be useful is to make sure that even when we have OKRs that are connected to something bigger, there shouldn't necessarily be a direct connection. There shouldn't be, we're doing this as part of that, because one of the anti-patterns of this direct connection is that it forces us to always look for that direct connection. So one interesting idea that can be an alternative to these direct connections is to just connect through alignment or relationship. To say, this is our OKR, for example, to go back to this example, we're going to work on enabling a viral loop. And the reason we're focusing on this right now is that we believe that enabling the viral loop is going to be a multiplier for our growth, and that would help us achieve the scalable growth. That's one potential reason why that might be useful. There might be another reason why that's useful, that it's in the local context. So we're not just looking for that one direct relationship. One other importance of this switch in language from a direct connection to the people coming up with an OKR somewhere in the network, talking about why now, why are we doing this, what is the OKR, is that it creates a better conversation between the different levels in the organization, the different people in the organization, that is more empowering and more involving, and makes sure that people are actually responsible for their objectives, the key results that are possible around these objectives, and some creative thinking about what these objectives should be. One of the key points about OKRs is that they shouldn't just be top down. There should be some alignment to the company level strategy, but we want the actual objectives for each level to be created and informed and committed with involvement of the people that are closest to the work. So it's a connection between that alignment and the actual work of the people, the actual knowledge of the people of what's the context, what's their capabilities. We want to make that connection in a smart way. One of those techniques is that why now that I mentioned, that you can read more about in Ben Lamort's OKR field book. The other some other inspiration for how to do this comes from agile approaches such as Scrum. So if we look at Scrum, one of the key techniques that we use there is Scrum and Kanban is pull mode. Basically, what we say is there's a difference between framing the what and the why, what's important, why do we want to go there, and the fact that we want teams to actually figure out how much, what is possible to actually do to try and work towards these goals. If we look at Scrum, there's the notion of the product owner who's responsible for the goal and identifying what's valuable. And we have the team, the developers who are actually working on developing some increment of business process, product, service, whatever. They are the ones that figure out what's actually possible. In the OKR space, the way we do this is the objective, the qualitative direction of where we're going comes from, what are we trying to achieve? What's the strategy? How are we looking to disrupt ourselves? The KRs are more, the key results are more around, okay, what's actually possible? Both, how will we measure that we're making progress? So what are the milestones or the notches on the vector of where we're going, but also how far do we believe we can actually get within reason based on where we are, what else we're doing. And that is a conversation between the people that are actually planning that OKR and the rest of the organization. And when we do that at scale, it's even more important to make it possible for people to actually frame their own OKRs, to plan their own OKRs. One of the techniques that that we want to make sure we have is that there's some sort of negotiation or back and forth, sharing our intent of what are we trying to achieve here. That could be by sharing company level OKRs that perhaps the leadership team comes up with. Then, different teams, different functions, maybe team of teams, people might self-organize in teams that they feel should work together to actually do something about the aspects of that bigger objective. And then they should share what is their belief of what's the objective that they should take on, and what are some key results that they believe are aspirational yet realistic. And they should share that with the other teams working on other aspects of the bigger objective and company leadership or the next level up. And there should be a conversation around, okay, is that aligned with where we're going? Is that enough? If it's not enough, is there something else we could do? But it should be something realistic. It's definitely not this level telling these people, this is your objective and these are the key results you are now committed to. Why not? Because company leadership does not really know what's possible at this level. They might know what they want to see happening. Even that, the details of, what do we really want to see in order to enable PLG? How do we actually, reduce friction in customer acquisition? What does that look like? Probably the people that are involved in friction and customer acquisition are better positioned to figure out the objective here and for sure the key results that make sense. So they should be involved in that conversation. One of the interesting patterns that I'm using with companies is to actually facilitate a big room OKR planning event where we bring in this context of company level OKRs, and we have these conversations between the different groups around how to actually deconstruct these company level OKRs, what needs to be true in order to achieve these company level OKRs, what needs to be true when it comes to interaction between different groups, different teams that will be responsible for aspects of this bigger objective. And together, we sort of create this network of objectives, this network of key results that is both aspirational, aligned, yet also realistic, but not less important, owned by the people that will be accountable for these OKRs. One of the interesting things that creates is a good question around, can we even establish committed key results at the company level before we actually do this exercise? So before we figure out what's possible throughout the company, can we come up with committed key results for the company level? And what I often see out there is that the answer is no. The answer is we might know the direction where we want this KR to tackle. We might know the metric, what we will measure in order to gauge how we're doing towards this objective. How far we will be able to go, probably not before we actually do this exercise where everybody's involved and we figure out this network of OKRs. That's where it gets challenging to plan and commit to OKRs at scale, and you need these sort of two-phase commits, if you want to call it that, exercises like this big room OKR planning. So let me pause to check if there are any comments in the chat. Not yet. Right. So let's see. let's kind of recap. I see a question from Bob. Let's try to feature that question on screen. So Bob Ellis, hi Bob, asks, how does application of an outcome measurement designed and implemented to validate the feature hypothesis statement fit into best practices of OKRs? So Bob refers to one of the techniques we use in frameworks such as SAFe, that talks about the fact that every feature, every requirement basically that we're focused on should have some sort of hypothesis statement. Why are we doing this? Why do we believe that this is useful? For me, that relates to the why now conversation. For me, the hypothesis statement is actually a good example of bringing evidence-based management into SAFe and into OKRs as well. OKRs do not explicitly call out the fact that there's some sort of hypothesis around what we're doing. But in environments of complexity, which is where most of our work happens, I do believe that there is an implicit hypothesis that we should test and measure. And I believe that calling out that hypothesis explicitly is actually useful. So I find it very useful that in SAFe, for example, we call out the hypothesis statement. And I like to make it explicit when I'm coaching teams through OKRs as well. So if we map this to how this works, let's say go back to that example of PLG. So that enablement of a viral loop. The assumption here, or the hypothesis here, is that if we, let's say the feature that we had in mind was to add an automated signature to emails that we send out that that share. If we use something like Dropbox, for example, one of the viral loop aspects in Dropbox is if you share a file with somebody else, what we could do is we could add a signature that indicates that we're sharing this file using Dropbox and invite somebody to create their own account. The hypothesis statement for that feature could be that we believe that if we add that signature, it would bring in some new leads into the service. The OKR around this, this would connect to the key result that we have for that viral loop that we'll probably talk about probably new leads that come through this viral loop. And that feature could be assessed as valuable towards that end or not valuable towards that end using that key result. That's the way I would connect it. So let's see. Bob also mentioned we use for steering the feature as its value continuously emerges. Temi Tope, I believe teams, departments, and groups can define their work project objectives to align with the overall corporate OKR. So maybe to use this as a recap, yes, sometimes. So some of the objectives for teams, departments, and groups would hopefully align to the overall corporate OKRs. Sometimes their objectives would not. Sometimes their objectives will be fed by the reason for being for that team, department, or group. It might be some developmental OKR for that group. It might be some strategy that this group is pursuing that's not, important enough in the scheme of things for the company to actually call out as a company OKR. For example, we might have the IT organization focused on dramatically enabling remote work as an objective, or moving to much more self-service and empowering people. But that's not one of the company level OKRs. It's really important for the IT organization, and it does relate to what the company is trying to do. It's not in conflict with the company's strategy, but it's not at the level of company strategy at the moment. I mean, it might be and it might not be. The other piece here is that I just want to re-emphasize that the way I like to do this runs counter to how most organizations do this. I don't start with the teams, department, and groups and ask them to come up with objectives. I start with the strategy for the organization and then see, okay, who needs to be involved in achieving this strategy? And if we map those objectives and try to see who's going to have to be involved in all of these strategies, it might tell us, it might paint a picture where the organization is too intermingled. There are too many dependencies. That might actually drive a conversation, not around creating better OKRs that help us divide and conquer, but actually thinking about how could we create a topology where this collaboration that is needed in order to achieve an OKR happens within a smaller scope, within a team or a teams of teams. For me, that's the most important thing about scaling. The first pattern of scaling is you want to first try to descale. You want to first break the problem or the objective into smaller objectives that smaller teams can really own and make an impact with. Not just own and have some activity and be busy around, but make a real impact with minimal collaboration and dependencies on other areas in the organization. So, what's next? We've talked about some scaling challenges and how that relates to how you organize around OKRs. We even mentioned a bit around the connection between scaling and how it starts to touch your agile practices. That might actually be where we go next in our next episode. I'll try to do a couple of more of those before everybody heads out for the holidays. So the next episode I'm thinking would be around where do OKRs meet your agile operating system, whether that's Scrum, Kanban, SAFe, what are some common confusion and friction points between these different roles? How could they actually support each other and bring some clarity towards why are we working this way and what's important to us to achieve in the scheme of things while we're focusing on our smaller increments, our sprints, our PIs. So that's what's coming up next. Looking forward to continuing the conversation on the chat in LinkedIn, YouTube, maybe even Facebook. Thank you, Bob and Temitope, for your comments. I hope this is useful. See you the next time. Bye-bye.